Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a truly fascinating journey back in time. We're opening up this, treasure trove of forgotten skills and, ancestral wisdom.
Yeah.
Our deep dive today pulls from sources like The Lost Ways and The Lost Ways 2, which they essentially offer a kind of blueprint for self-reliance.
Especially in a world that's always changing, sometimes, pretty unpredictably.
Right.
Indeed, this deep dive is all about uncovering that practical knowledge, the stuff that allowed pioneers, ancient cultures even, to not just survive, but really thrive, often with, incredibly minimal resources. Our mission today is really to extract those vital nuggets of information, making food, tools, building communities, staying safe, all that stuff, and see how understanding these lost ways might just be, maybe the ultimate shortcut to being truly well-informed for whatever the future holds.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's unpack this. We're talking about everything from crafting survival foods that seem to last forever to building your own shelter, even understanding, old school law enforcement. So get ready for some surprising facts and I think plenty of aha moments that might make you rethink what being resourceful actually means.
Okay, let's start with arguably the most fundamental aspect of self-reliance. Food.
Makes sense.
Our ancestors had some incredibly ingenious ways to feed themselves and, crucially, make that food last, for a long time.
What's truly fascinating here is how they maximize nutrition and shelf life with such basic ingredients. It seems like it was often through just sheer observation, maybe trial and error over generations.
And when we talk basic, our sources introduce us to hardtack.
Ah, yes.
Now, this isn't your grandma's cookies. It's just a simple biscuit.
What?
Water, flour, salt. That's it.
But incredibly durable.
Oh, its longevity is legendary. I mean, Civil War soldiers were apparently eating hardtack from the Mexican-American War back in 1848.
Wow.
And there are records of still edible hardtack from 1862.
It's described as being more akin to bricks than actual food. Apparently, you literally had to worry about your teeth if you tried it.
Yeah, I've heard that. Soaking in coffee or something.
Right. But despite how unappetizing it sounds, it's actually getting pretty popular with modern preppers today.
For the same reasons, I bet. Extreme efficiency, incredible resilience.
Exactly. That simple biscuit really sums up a core principle, mastering the fundamentals.
It does. And if we're looking for maybe the ultimate example of a nutritionally complete survival food, it has to be pemmican.
Ah, pemmican. I've heard of that.
Yeah, this dense, really nutritious blend of dried meat and fat. It originated with North American natives, and early pioneers picked it up. It became such a valuable commodity. The Hudson Bay Company actually bought tons of it every year from native tribes.
So what exactly goes into this powerhouse food?
Well, the composition is pretty precise. It's roughly 50% shredded, dehydrated lean meat and 50% rendered fat by weight. Sometimes they'd add maybe 5% dried and ground berries, like Saskatoon berries, for flavor, maybe some extra micronutrients.
Right.
But what makes pemmican really remarkable is its nutritional quality. If it's made properly, you could apparently eat it for months, even years, as your only food source.
Seriously, no deficiencies.
That's what the sources claim. Even vitamin C, potentially, if raw meat or organ meats were properly included and prepared.
Wow.
The preparation was meticulous. Low temperature drying for the meat, like under 120 Fahrenheit, ideally lower, to keep nutrients intact. Careful rendering of the fat, again at low temps, below 250, to preserve the fatty acids.
That sounds almost scientific.
It really does.
Oh.
It speaks to this deep understanding of nutrition that ancient peoples had centuries before we started talking about, biohacking or anything like that.
That's incredible. A total nutritional powerhouse from, pretty basic stuff. But beyond these, hardcore survival staples, our sources also reveal some really ingenious forgotten recipes from the 18th and 19th centuries. Real resourcefulness on display.
Like what?
Well, think about dishes like bacon fried apples. Simple, sounds delicious, and a great way to use every bit of that rendered bacon grease.
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
Or mock turtle soup. It was a practical adaptation, using whatever meat was on hand, plus root vegetables, maybe some red wine, to kind of mimic a fancier, more expensive dish.
Adapting to what you have.
Exactly. And then there was comforting stuff like cornmeal mush, made from cornmeal and bone broth, left overnight, then fried up golden brown. These weren't just recipes, they were lifelines showing how people just adapted constantly.
Okay, so once you had this food, the next critical thing was storage, right? Especially without modern refrigeration.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our ancestors relied heavily on the root cellar for long-term, cool, dark storage.
Right, like nature's refrigerator.
Exactly. The ideal conditions are pretty specific. Consistent cool temperatures, maybe 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and really high humidity, like 90–95%.
How'd they manage the humidity?
Simple methods, really.
Yeah.
Wide, shallow pans of water left out to evaporate, or burying roots in damp sand or sawdust to stop them drying out.
Clever.
Ventilation was also key, often managed with intake and exhaust vents to keep the air fresh and prevent mold.
So what could they store in there?
All sorts of things. Cured meats, bottled drinks, and lots of produce, potatoes, cabbage, carrots, apples, squash, onions. Though some things like sweet potatoes needed drier conditions, it kept food good for months.
And beyond the root cellar, they were apparently masters of preserving meat for months, maybe even a year. How did they manage that without a fridge?
Well, they used a few key techniques. One was rendering lard, usually from pork back fat. That lard could then be used for cooking or even as a preservative layer.
Okay.
Then there was this intensive but apparently very effective process of curing half a pig for a year.
A whole
Yeah. It involved multiple stages. Heavy salting first, meticulously flipping the meat twice a day for like 2 weeks. Wow, that's dedication. And they even had this clever trick to check the salt level of the curing broth using an egg. If it floated just right, the brine's density was good.
simple quality control.
Exactly. After the brine and then drying, the meat could apparently last a year or more.
Amazing.
And of course, smoking meats like sausages and bacon was vital. They'd often use a cold smoking process with sawdust from fruit trees or oak or beech. Smoke it for 3 to 5 days, maybe even up to a week for longer preservation.
It's really about transforming perishable stuff into something that lasts.
Totally. It shows an incredible understanding of, well, food chemistry, long before we had the science spelled out.
It really is amazing.
And speaking of ingenious preservation, the Inca civilization developed something that sounds like a precursor to modern freeze-drying. They called it chuños.
Tuños.
Yeah, it's Quechua for wrinkle, which perfectly describes how these dehydrated potatoes look. When they're stored properly, chuños can last for decades.
Decades. How did they make them?
It was quite a process. They'd select similar-sized potatoes, then leave them out in the freezing Andes nights. The freezing breaks down the cell walls.
Okay.
Then, during the day, they'd expose them to the sun and squeeze them repeatedly to press out the water. This freezing, sun-drying, squeezing cycle was repeated.
So it shrinks them down.
Significantly. Finally, they were peeled and allowed to harden. The result was lightweight, super long-lasting, and easily reconstituted. Just soak them in water.
That's incredible, leveraging the environment itself.
Exactly. A testament to how ancient cultures used natural elements for survival.
Okay, now imagine a world where your grocery store is literally the wilderness around you. Our ancestors' knowledge of wildcrafting, collecting wild edibles was absolutely crucial.
But incredibly dangerous if you don't know what you're doing.
Right. Safety was paramount. Which brings us to something called the universal edibility test.
Yes, this is really important. It's a methodical, step-by-step process for figuring out if an unknown plant is safe to eat.
How does it work?
It involves a sequence of tests, gradually introducing the plant. First smell, then contact with your skin, then your lip, then tongue, then chewing a small amount.
And waiting between each step.
Exactly. Waiting periods are crucial to see if there's any reaction. Finally, swallowing a tiny bit and waiting again. It's slow, but absolutely vital because so many plants look similar and some are dead.
Once you know what's safe, though,
the wilderness transforms into a pantry.
So what are some of the most, maybe, surprising or versatile examples from the sources?
Well, cattails are often called the supermarket of the swamp or the survival plant of wetlands.
Why is that?
You can eat the starchy roots. The young shoots taste like cucumber, apparently. The pollen can be used like flour for biscuits. And it has medicinal uses, too. It's incredibly versatile.
Okay, wow.
Then there's wild lettuce, sometimes called opium lettuce.
Sounds intense.
Well, it contains this milky substance lacticarium, which was used historically as a natural painkiller and sedative. Not actual opium, but it had noticeable effects. The common dandelion, entirely edible. Young leaves in salads, older ones boiled like spinach. The roots make a coffee like tea. Flowers as garnish. Plus, it's a common herbal remedy.
Stuff we see every day.
Exactly. And for a staple that required more effort, acorns. Edible, but you have to leach out the bitter tannins first. Lots of soaking. Then you can use them as flour or even a coffee substitute.
It all comes down to deep knowledge of your local environment. That was their ultimate food security.
Precisely.
Okay, moving beyond food. Our ancestors were also incredible engineers, crafters, able to make just about anything they needed from scratch.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder how much of our modern comfort relies on things we can no longer produce ourselves.
Totally. That self-sufficiency extended to everything, like good old-fashioned cooking on an open flame.
Right. And cast iron cookware was king there.
Why cast iron?
Incredible durability, perfect heat distribution for open fire cooking. Seasoning, it was simple. Just oil it up and heat it over coals.
And the big rule.
Never use dish soap. It breaks down that essential oily coating. Instead, they used stiff brushes, maybe steel wool, or even bundles of horsetail plants for scrubbing.
Horsetail.
Yeah. For roasting meats, they'd use a spit, turning it over the coals, collecting the drippings. Or for smaller game, they might suspend it on a string, twisting it to ensure it cooked evenly.
And the Dutch oven.
Ah, the Dutch oven. Incredibly versatile. Baking, stewing, frying. Temperature control was all about managing the coals more on top for baking, maybe all underneath for frying or simmering. Need good gloves and a lid lifter, though.
It's incredible how much just one pine tree could provide. The sources detail how our ancestors made candles and even glue from pine resin.
Resourceful.
For candles, apparently they'd just collect the sticky resin, melt it down, filter out the debris, add a wick, and let it harden. Simple. And for glue, melt and filter the resin again, but then mix it with crushed charcoal. That created a really strong, durable adhesive. Good for tool repairs, waterproofing, all sorts of things.
It's a great example of seeing multiple uses in a single natural resource.
Absolutely. Now, in a world without, mass-produced hygiene products, knowing how to make soap was critical.
Absolutely fundamental. The process itself is called saponification, basically a chemical reaction between a fat or oil and a strong base.
The base being lye.
Exactly. Traditionally, lye was made from hardwood ash. You'd slowly pour water over the ash in a container, collect the liquid, and filter it repeatedly until it was strong enough.
How'd they know it was strong enough?
They had this empirical test seeing if a chicken feather would dissolve in it.
Seriously?
Apparently so. This lye water was then carefully combined with rendered animal fat, like hog fat, and heated to make soap. A pretty caustic process, requires care.
Sounds like it.
Now, the sources also mentioned that you can use modern ingredients, commercial lye, specific oils for a more controlled cold process method. It still needs careful handling, but maybe more predictable results.
Okay, from hygiene to fuel and filtration, charcoal. We use it for grilling, but it's surprisingly essential. And our ancestors had methods like the clamp production to make it, basically lighting a wood fire, covering it with turf and soil, and letting it smolder in a controlled way.
Right, controlling the oxygen. But what's really fascinating is how they could turn that basic charcoal into activated charcoal.
The stuff used in filters.
Exactly. Activated charcoal is made by taking clean charcoal and processing it, often involving chemicals like calcium chloride and heat, to create tons of microscopic pores. This massively increases its surface area.
And that's the key.
That's the key. Those tiny activated pores give it this incredible ability to absorb chemicals, poisons, toxins, impurities. That's why it's invaluable for water filtration and even in gas masks.
Gas masks?
Yeah. Historically, activated charcoal was a crucial component in early gas mask filters, like in World War I. Its effectiveness was really highlighted after industrial disasters, too.
So they figured this out without modern labs.
It seems so. Turning a simple byproduct into a powerful medical and protective tool just by manipulating its physical properties. It really highlights how innovation often comes from just keenly observing and working with natural materials.
Let's talk about the bow and arrow, a weapon that has truly stood the test of time.
Absolutely. The sources highlight its historical significance, how much more efficient it was than spears for hunting. It really changed things.
What did crafting one actually involve? It sounds complex.
It was definitely an intricate artisan process. You'd start by selecting the right wood for the bow. Ash, hickory, oak were common. Then getting it, drying it carefully, shaping it with maybe an axe, a draw knife, or even sharp pieces of glass or just sandpaper.
Wow, glass.
Yeah, it's a scraper. Then cutting the string notches and carefully bending the bow, often using a bending plank, constantly checking its flex so it wouldn't break but had power.
And the string?
Could be made from surprising things, like animal sinew or even processed pig intestine, cleaned, fat removed, spliced together, twisted tightly under pressure, then coated with beeswax for protection.
And the arrows?
Needed to be straight. Willow was a good choice. Stripped, straightened, often using heat, sometimes soaked in linseed oil, and then fletched, adding feathers using gut bindings and that pine resin glue we talked about.
It's a profound understanding of materials.
Totally. Optimizing everything nature provided.
Okay, access to fresh water, always paramount. How did pioneers manage that before modern pumps and infrastructure?
Well, early on, they often started with just basic shallow pits dug near springs or lakes, sometimes using layers of sand for rudimentary purification.
Like a simple filter.
Exactly. But as they needed more reliable, deeper sources, they developed more advanced drilling methods. One notable technique mentioned is the spring pole well.
Spring pole.
Yeah, it used a long, flexible pole, anchored at one end, acting like a spring. It had a stirrup for the operator to push down on, a fulcrum point, and a heavy drill string with specialized bits. Pushing down bent the pole, releasing it made the pole spring back up, lifting the drill tools, which then dropped hard to chip away at the earth or rock.
Ingenious, using leverage and natural springiness.
Very. Later, the walking beam became another key device in drilling technology. But the sources even give a practical guide for digging your own well today if you needed to.
Really?
Yeah, finding water using test pits, the importance of shoring up the walls as you dig to prevent collapse, building a stone or brick base, constructing the walls, filtering the inflow with coarse gravel. It's all about accessing and managing that critical resource safely.
All right, let's talk about harnessing the environment for heavy lifting. Building mills, sawmills, grain mills, stamping mills for ore.
This is where they really started automating work using natural power.
What was key to their efficiency? The water wheel?
Yes, particularly the overshot water wheel. This was a significant innovation. Unlike undershot wheels that rely on the force of the water hitting paddles, the overshot wheel has buckets that fill with water at the top.
Ah, so it uses the weight of the water.
Exactly. The weight of the water turns the wheel. This made it much more efficient and often usable even with lower water flow or year-round if the water source didn't freeze solid.
Clever. How did they transfer that power?
With gears. Made of wood initially, later metal. Spur gears, crown gears, lantern gears. These allowed them to change the direction of the rotation and, crucially, alter the speed and torque for different tasks. Slower, powerful rotation for grinding grain, faster for sawing wood.
And they could switch things on and off.
Yeah, often using belts, typically leather straps connecting the main shaft to individual machines like saws. They could slip the belt off to disconnect power without stopping the whole mill. Lubrication, often with animal fat or tallow, was also vital to keep everything running smoothly.
It's impressive engineering, using just water and wood and maybe some metal.
Absolutely. Leveraging natural forces for large-scale work long before steam engines became common.
Now, while individual self-reliance is obviously key in these sources, they also really highlight that true resilience often comes from community.
That's a crucial point. Looking at the bigger picture, understanding how frontier societies functioned, offers potentially vital lessons, especially if you consider potential breakdowns in modern systems.
Right. And when you think of frontier communities, you often think of the Old West, maybe from movies.
Yeah, the Hollywood version.
But the reality, according to these sources, was often quite different. Typical Western towns actually had less crime than many places today.
Really? Why?
Largely due to the self-reliant but also highly cooperative nature of the settlers. They needed each other. Law enforcement often fell to elected sheriffs. These were usually trusted, powerful figures in the community, and they could appoint deputies as needed.
So, thinking about that collapse scenario,
Yeah.
what elements of law enforcement could actually be replicated? It's an interesting question.
It is. Threats back then often came from outside the community, outlaw gangs, maybe big ranchers hiring gunslingers, or sometimes, sadly, broken relations with Native American tribes.
And firearms. The sources mention those.
They do, and they challenge the whole six-shooter on every hip myth. Rifles were apparently far more common practical for hunting and defense.
Makes sense. More versatile.
But interestingly, if there was one gun that won the West, the sources argue it was the humble 12-gauge shotgun.
The shotgun. Why?
Because of its versatility. Great for hunting birds and small game, but also incredibly effective for self-defense at the short to medium ranges common in town or homestead defense. Practical utility over romantic notions. So what does this all mean for us today, thinking about community organization for safety?
Well, the sources really emphasize the importance of community effort. There's the obvious safety in numbers idea, but also better awareness of potential threats, sharing the burden so no one person is overwhelmed, and being able to protect more vulnerable members.
How did they suggest organizing neighbors?
Strategies included talking to people individually or maybe holding small group meetings. The key was focusing on mutual benefits, better security for everyone, maybe cooperating on food production, saving time through shared tasks. Building trust was essential.
What about things like patrolling?
For patrolling and deterrence, the idea was that deputies, often volunteers, should be visible but also approachable, talking to people, gathering information informally, building that trust. It wasn't just about showing force. It was about being connected to the community and even monitoring internal stress or disputes before they escalated.
And if a major threat appeared?
Then they might raise a posse. Its historical function wasn't just chasing fugitives like in the movies. It was primarily a means of community self-defense against a large group of attackers. Organizing one involved practical things like having a designated assembly point, organizing people into teams, maybe even keeping some folks in reserve. It was about collective, organized defense when needed.
Okay, switching gears a bit. Imagine a world without cell phones, without the internet. How did our ancestors manage communication in a disconnected world?
That's a fascinating challenge they faced. I mean, sure, there were things like Pony Express riders for a brief time, and then the telegraph revolutionized things.
Right, but those are big systems. What about more covert or localized methods?
Exactly. Our sources detail some really ingenious ways of hiding messages. One technique involved musket ball messages.
Musket balls.
Yeah, they'd apparently hollow out a lead musket ball, place a small folded message inside, and maybe seal it. The carrier could potentially swallow it if they were about to be captured. There's a story about a spy named Daniel Taylor doing just that during the Revolutionary War.
Oh, drastic.
Definitely. Then there was invisible ink. This could be made with relatively simple chemistry, like using ferrous sulfate solution that becomes visible when treated with heat or another chemical, or even simpler, just lemon juice. Write with lemon juice, let it dry, and the message appears when the paper is gently heated.
Anyone could do that with kitchen supplies.
Pretty much. And finally, a really clever one, mask letters. You'd write a seemingly innocent decoy message, but arranged on the page so that a specific cutout template, the mask laid over it, would reveal a hidden message within the gaps or certain letters.
Like a secret decoder ring, but with paper.
Kind of. The mask and the letter would often be sent by different routes for extra security. It just shows incredible cleverness in protecting information when technology was limited.
Okay, let's circle back to essentials. Water is life, and the sources show just how critical its preservation and purification was, especially in really challenging environments like the open sea.
It really does make you think about the hidden infrastructure supporting our daily habits, doesn't it? For 17th century sailors, water preservation was a massive issue. Long voyages, tiny daily rations, sometimes only a quarter gallon per person per day in the Spanish Navy.
How did they make it last or taste okay?
Well, historical solutions included sweetening stale water with wine or beer. Later, especially after the British conquest of Jamaica, rum became popular, leading to the infamous grog watered-down rum.
Trying to make bad water drinkable.
Exactly. They also had ingenious methods for getting fresh water when possible, towing sealed casks ashore to fill them from streams or pumps, using sailcloth arrangements to catch rainwater, even collecting morning dew from the ship's surfaces. Every drop counted.
And I read something about silver coins.
Yes. Sailors would often place silver coins in their water barrels. They believed it prevented spoilage. And there's likely some truth to it. Silver does have known antimicrobial properties, an early, intuitive form of water treatment.
So that's at sea. What about land-based water security? We touched on wells, but what about filtering and storage?
Right. Our ancestors used sand filters pretty early on, maybe multi-foot deep filters back in the 1600s. But they knew it wasn't perfect, boiling it. The water afterwards was still recommended. And the key was regularly cleaning or replacing that top layer of sand where most impurities collected.
And charcoal filters.
Yes, simple charcoal filters were also effective. Maybe layers of cloth, crushed charcoal, then another cloth layer in a container. The sources stressed that tightly packed charcoal and a slow drip rate were important for good purification. Again, using that amazing adsorptive property of charcoal.
What about storing water safely?
They considered container types carefully. Historically, wood casks, pottery. Today, the sources mention looking at modern options. For plastic, look for food-safe recycling symbols, though maybe be cautious with number 7. For glass, food-safe types like borosilicate, like Pyrex, are good, but you have to be mindful of breakage.
And rainwater.
Rainwater harvesting was definitely practiced. Those ancestral techniques at sea involved plugging deck scuppers or using canvas funnels. On land, it's simpler attaching barrels to downspouts from roofs. But the sources do caution. You'd want to be mindful of potential atmospheric pollutants and maybe check the water's pH level depending on your area. It's about having multiple layers of security for that most vital resource. And what's really interesting is how they made more than just water palatable, especially for long journeys or just daily life back then. Making homemade beer was incredibly common.
Safer than water sometimes, right?
Often, yes, due to the boiling involved in brewing. They used all sorts of grains: barley, millet, corn, rice, wheat, spelt. The process involved making malt sprouting and crushing the grains to release sugars and creating yeast, sometimes just from grain and water left out, or using the natural bloom found on fruits like grapes.
And hops.
Hops were used when available for flavor and preservation, but they used other bittering herbs too if hops weren't around.
And from beer or other fermented liquids, they could even make stronger stuff using homemade stills.
Precisely. Distillation, the process of heating a liquid to evaporate components, then cooling the vapor to condense it back into liquid, allowed them to create stronger alcoholic drinks. Think whiskey, often called moonshine if made illicitly, or brandy from fermented fruit mash.
What does the still involve?
A basic still has four main parts: a heater for the pot, a column where vapors rise, a condenser, often a coil in cold water, to cool the vapor, and a vessel to collect the distilled liquid. The whole principle relies on different components like alcohol and water boiling at different temperatures.
Is it dangerous?
It can be. There's a critical safety warning repeated in the sources. Always discard the first 5% to 10% of the liquid that comes out of the still, the 4 shots. This fraction contains harmful methanol, which boils at a lower temperature than the desirable ethanol. Consuming methanol can cause blindness or death.
Okay, very important safety tip.
Absolutely. Historically, though, distillation was common practice, tied to traditions like the Royal Navy's daily rum ration, the tot, which amazingly was only discontinued in 1970. Apparently, mixing alcohol in guided missiles wasn't seen as a good idea anymore.
Wow. From the humble brick-like hardtack to these complex community structures and distillation, this deep dive into the lost ways of our ancestors has been incredibly rich.
It really has.
It's just a powerful reminder that ingenuity, resourcefulness, and maybe a deep connection to the natural world, these things are truly timeless.
Indeed. We've explored skills that were once just commonplace. Skills that allow people not just to get by, but to genuinely thrive in environments that we'd find incredibly challenging today. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? In our world, which seems increasingly reliant on complex, sometimes fragile systems, what truly separates survival from thriving? And maybe more importantly, what lost ways do you think we still carry within us, perhaps just waiting to be rediscovered?
Think about it. What ancient skill will you look into next?